family-friendly set, and my kids came to visit, and yeah, she always had her children around, and I love that you acknowledge the birth.
Hey folks, Dave Neal here, stand-up comic and host of the Rush Hour podcast, back with some bonus weekend coverage. What has quickly turned into the Super Bowl of online legal drama is the ongoing Justin Baldoni versus Blake Lively dispute, and we've now officially entered one of the most important phases of the case. Expert reports. Baldoni's side has submitted its expert analysis, and the conclusion is clear: there was no coordinated smear campaign directed at Blake Lively. Now, to be fair, experts are typically hired to support a party's position, and that skepticism is healthy. But this isn't some random consultant offering vague opinions. The expert involved here is highly credentialed and appears to have a deep understanding of crisis communications, litigation strategy, and reputational analysis. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the substance of that report, the overarching conclusions, the supporting evidence, and the specific reasoning used to explain why the expert believes the smear narrative doesn't hold up under scrutiny. The takeaway isn't exactly flattering for Blake Lively, because the argument essentially suggests that public sentiment shifted organically rather than through any coordinated effort, a point critics have been making from the beginning. Will this suddenly convince Blake Lively's most dedicated supporters? Probably not. But the real audience here isn't social media, it's a potential jury. And when you look at this through that lens, it's not hard to imagine Baldoni's peers finding this analysis credible and persuasive. My personal read is that this report nudges the case closer to a settlement, especially since the judge has now asked both sides to explore that option. Whether that actually happens remains to be seen. Don't hold your breath, but this week could be pivotal if no settlement is reached. The trial is currently scheduled for the end of May, and I'll be in New York City covering it every step of the way. I've already been here this week, taking in the city while braving some brutally cold but oddly beautiful Christmas season weather. So with that context set, let's dive straight into the documents themselves. Over the years, he explains that he has also authored a wide range of articles, white papers, and other written materials focused on communications strategy, many of which have appeared in major publications such as USA Today, the National Law Journal, the New York Law Journal, Business Law, and numerous other outlets. The list goes on at length. And the point is clear. He spends considerable time establishing why he is qualified to speak as an expert in this space. He lays out his background, his experience, and the breadth of his work. And at a certain point, you get it, we understand why he's being presented as an authority here, so we can move forward. From there, he shifts into explaining his actual assignment in this case. He states that he was retained by Liner, Friedman, Tattleman & Cully, LLP on behalf of their clients to prepare a report focused on crisis communications planning, scenario planning, and standard public relations practices when an individual or organization is facing potentially negative reputational events. Specifically, he was asked to analyze best practices within public relations, particularly the subcategory of crisis communications, and to explain why these practices exist in the first place, namely to minimize reputational risk and prevent damage to both personal and organizational brands. He notes that, in preparing this report, he reviewed a scope of work document created by TAG, a crisis communications firm, as well as a document titled Scenario Planning. It ends with us, along with other publicly available materials. What he is ultimately setting up here is an explanation not just for the court, but for a potential jury, of why crisis communications are commonly used and why their use does not imply wrongdoing. Hiring a crisis communications team does not mean you cause the crisis, it means you are responding to shifting public sentiment and trying to manage fallout. In this report, he discusses issues like cast members unfollowing Baldoni and the types of actions a team might reasonably take to mitigate reputational damage when millions of dollars are at stake and a film's success depends on public perception. The logic is straightforward. If the house is on fire, your first instinct is to put it out, not to debate who struck the match. That's the role of crisis communications, Blake Lively's side. However, wants the public to believe the opposite, that the very act of hiring crisis communicators is proof that a crisis was intentionally created, pushing the narrative into an offensive posture rather than a defensive one. With that framing established, Haggerty moves past the formalities and toward the substance of the case, presenting his summary of findings. After reviewing the materials provided, conducting independent research and analysis, and drawing on his own professional experience in crisis and legally related communications, he states that he is prepared to testify to his conclusions. Crisis communications management in the face of reputational risk has long been recognized as an ethical, standard, and widely accepted practice for addressing potential issues across traditional media, social media, and other key audiences. In the modern media environment, where narratives can spread instantly and misinformation can travel faster than facts, a lack of preparation can dramatically accelerate a reputational crisis. When organizations or individuals fail to plan for these moments, the damage to brand, credibility, and public trust can compound quickly. That's why the absence of crisis communications planning is often far more harmful than its presence. To borrow from the analogy I mentioned earlier, it's a bit like wildfire prevention. Controlled burns or preemptive measures don't mean you started the fire. They mean you're trying to prevent it from consuming everything in its path. Maybe it's not a perfect comparison, but the idea holds. Crisis communications is about doing what you can to manage a situation that is by definition largely outside your control. It's about mitigating damage, not proving intent. And that's the key distinction here. The hiring of a crisis management consultant is not evidence of wrongdoing or some nefarious plan. It is ethical, prudent, and standard practice across industries whenever reputational risk is present. Unfortunately, popular media portrayals and widespread misinformation about what crisis communications professionals actually do have contributed to a distorted and often negative perception of their role. The scope of work agreement prepared by TAG, along with the subsequent scenario planning document, aligns squarely with established norms in the crisis communications field and reflects reactive planning, not premeditated manipulation. Changing public opinion, especially in media and social media, happens overnight. In reality, meaningful shifts in sentiment typically take weeks, and often months, to materialize. That's why the idea that negative reputational sentiment could be artificially manufactured in just a few days is highly implausible. Even the analytical tools used to track media and social sentiment become less reliable during litigation or other sensitive disputes, which makes it especially important to drill down into the data and avoid jumping to conclusions about cause and effect relationships. Speaking from personal experience, I have a degree in marketing and briefly worked in advertising feels like a lifetime ago, but I was also involved in the Public Relations Student Society of America, PRSSA, where one of the first things you learn is that not all PR serves the same function. Crisis PR is fundamentally different from general or promotional PR. One is defensive, designed to respond to threats and mitigate harm, while the other is proactive, focused on feel-good stories, press opportunities, and promotion. The PR needed to market a movie is not the same as the PR required when a director or actor is suddenly facing damaging narratives online. In this situation, Baldoni was clearly on his heels, reacting to a rapidly shifting public perception, fueled by cast members unfollowing him and speculation spiraling out of control. From a professional standpoint, it makes complete sense that his team would say, "We need a plan in place in case Blake Lively makes a public statement that could significantly damage our reputation or mobilize a massive fan base against us." That concern alone justifies defensive planning. And yes, while we're on the subject of Taylor Swift's influence, if you haven't watched the new documentary on Disney+, the first 2 episodes are already out and I'll just say this, it's genuinely good. I haven't lost faith in Taylor Swift. We haven't seen Taylor Swift publicly align herself with Blake Lively on this. And while she hasn't spoken out at all, there's still a sense of optimism that she ultimately land on what many would consider the right side of this situation. With that aside, the report then moves into a broader overview of crisis communications and scenario planning, laying the groundwork for the expert's core analysis. For the purposes of the report, he emphasizes that it's essential to understand what crisis communications and scenario planning actually are and why they matter, particularly when it comes to managing reputational risk for organizations of all sizes, as well as for individuals who can suddenly find themselves thrust into an intense and unwanted media or social media spotlight. Reputation, he explains, is a foundational element of any brand, playing a critical role in shaping stakeholder perceptions and directly influencing outcomes in today's business environment. Because of that, crisis communications planning is considered a central pillar of reputation management, designed to manage and mitigate the impact of unexpected events that could otherwise damage operations, credibility, and public trust. He cites a definition from a 2004 Harvard Business School press publication that frames a crisis as a sudden or evolving change that creates an urgent problem requiring immediate attention, noting that for businesses, a crisis is anything with the potential to cause sudden and serious harm to employees' reputation, or the bottom line. From there, he naturally plugs his own book, Chief Crisis Officer, and honestly, fair enough, where he defines a crisis as an unstable or critical state of affairs that threatens to have a negative impact on an organization's reputation, business, or goals. At this point, the definitions are clear enough to move forward, because the broader objective here is obvious: to explain why Baldoni's team reasonably want to protect his image if he's expected to continue serving as both the star and director of a major film, steering the project forward and ultimately getting people into theater seats. That part isn't complicated. Where the analysis becomes more consequential is in the expert's central claim that there simply would not have been enough time to orchestrate the kind of negative smear campaign Baldoni is accused of running. His argument is that the negative public sentiment toward Blake Lively escalated far too quickly to have been artificially manufactured, suggesting instead that it was organic. That may sound uncomfortable, but it aligns with how the internet actually works. Topics go viral, narratives take off, and suddenly criticism snowballs into a trend almost overnight. The report then addresses allegations in the second amended complaint, which claimed that the retention of Miss Nathan, followed by the hiring of another consultant in Texas, Jed Wallace of Street Relations, resulted in a surge of negative media and social media sentiment beginning around August 8th. This alleged effort is described variously as social manipulation or a coordinated social attack, supposedly going beyond standard public relations practices and involving the weaponization of a nationwide digital network to create, seed, promote, and engage with content designed to appear authentic across social media platforms and online forums. However, based on the same allegations, Miss Nathan was not retained until August 2nd, and Mr. Wallace was not brought on until at least August 8th, the very same day the complaint claims. Blake Lively experienced a sharp spike in negative sentiment, drawing on his professional experience. The expert concludes that it is highly unlikely, bordering on implausible, that a sophisticated digital marketing or social manipulation campaign could be conceived, built, and deployed within a matter of days, let alone on the same day. In short, the timeline doesn't support the accusation. What Blake's side is essentially trying to suggest is that the moment these consultants were hired, someone flipped a switch and unleashed a coordinated hate machine like, all right, let it roll. And suddenly, overnight, public opinion turned and Blake Lively became universally disliked. That's the picture they want people to believe. But what the expert is pushing back on is the reality of how digital marketing and online sentiment actually work. He points to industry benchmarks, citing estimates from Metric Marketing, a digital marketing firm based in Michigan, which explain that search engine optimization efforts typically take 3 to 6 months before results even begin to appear, and in highly competitive spaces it can take a year or more. Content marketing follows a similar timeline, creating material for owned platforms, third-party blogs, and media outlets usually take several months to a year before it produces meaningful impact, depending on quality, relevance, and reach. And while there are many forms of digital marketing, everything from SEO to organic social posting to more complex, computer-generated strategies involving bots or even artificial intelligence, the expert notes that, in his experience with high-profile legal disputes, these efforts also take time to plan, execute, and gain traction. They don't materialize instantly. From there, he references other real-world examples and case studies showing how long it has historically taken to shift public perception in similar situations, reinforcing the idea that sentiment change is a slow burn, not an overnight detonation. The report then turns to the second amended complaint, which includes 3 charts that allegedly demonstrate a massive surge in negative media and social media sentiment, beginning on August 8th. One of those charts tracks the net volume of positive versus negative mentions of Blake Lively. This is where the expert starts to apply real scrutiny, because while charts and data look authoritative, they're only as reliable as the methodology behind them. What does net volume actually mean? How are positive and negative mentions defined? How do you quantify something that is inherently subjective, like whether a post is favorable or unfavorable? If a handful of widely shared videos or clips circulate moments where Blake comes across poorly in interviews or interactions with reporters, it's completely predictable that those clips would generate waves of negative reactions. That doesn't require coordination. That's just how virality works. When the complaint points to a chart full of red and says, "Look at all this negative sentiment," the expert's response is essentially yes, the internet was reacting. When public opinion turns, it tends to turn loudly and all at once. We've seen this pattern countless times. Once people decide they don't like something, they pile on, amplify each other, and reinforce the narrative. In Blake Lively's case, a major factor appears to be how audiences reacted to the way she promoted the film, which felt jarring to some after not seeing much of her in the public eye for a while. When she re-emerged in promotion mode, the tone didn't land the way people expected, and that disconnect fueled criticism. The key point Baldoni's team is making, backed by this expert, is simple. They didn't create this reaction. They didn't manufacture the backlash. The sentiment already existed, and once it started spreading, it fed itself organically. In other words, they're arguing that the so-called monster wasn't engineered, it was already there. In the second amended complaint, none of the charts that are offered actually explain how the data was compiled. There's no discussion of methodology, no explanation of how decisions were made about what counts as a positive versus a negative mention, and not even a clear indication of what monitoring service or software was used to generate the sentiment analysis in the first place. Drawing on his experience preparing reports in sensitive crisis and legally related communications, the expert explains that without transparency around methodology and without a deeper examination of the underlying media mention, impossible to determine whether the data accurately reflects public sentiment at all. In other words, if you don't define the rules, the numbers don't mean much, and that's a fair point. Without a clear metric for what qualifies as positive or negative, how can anyone reasonably rely on the conclusions being drawn from it? He goes on to explain that, absent further analysis, it's entirely possible that any mention of the dispute between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni was automatically logged as a negative for Lively, regardless of whether the coverage was neutral. balanced, or even favorable to her position. Simply referencing the existence of a dispute can, by its very nature, be flagged as negative sentiment by many automated tools. That's a well-known limitation of online sentiment analysis. These algorithms often lack the nuance required to evaluate complex, evolving disputes, especially when both parties are public figures and the coverage itself is largely factual or explanatory rather than judgmental. Once public attention turned to the tension between Lively and Baldoni, with factors like cast members unfollowing Baldoni on social media and his absence from the It Ends With Us premiere, any discussion of those events could easily be interpreted by monitoring software as negative sentiment, even if the tone of the coverage wasn't critical. The expert notes that he's encountered this exact issue in prior crises he's worked on. When his team drilled down into the individual social media posts and reviewed them carefully, they found that the media monitoring service had mischaracterized large portions of the data because the automated criteria used to score sentiment were flawed. The system didn't account for the underlying tone of the articles being shared. And in many cases, the headlines and summaries were neutral. A tweet sharing a neutral article without added commentary was automatically categorized as neutral rather than positive, even if the article itself supported his client's position. There was no mechanism for the algorithm to evaluate the substance of the content being shared without a manual review. When his team went back and reanalyzed the data, an enormous task given the thousands of related social media posts, they discovered that the initial conclusions were significantly off. Instead of 2/3 of the content being neutral, truly neutral, sentiment accounted for less than 20%. The key takeaway for this case, he emphasizes, isn't that negative sentiment didn't exist, it clearly did, but that without a deeper understanding of how the data was generated and whether it's valid, it's impossible to draw reliable conclusions from it. That brings us to what comes next, the expert's conclusion. His role moving forward is to communicate these findings clearly and credibly to a jury. Knowing he'll be cross-examined aggressively by Blake Lively's side, he'll be relying on his experience as the CEO of a firm that specializes in exactly this kind of crisis work, backed by real case studies and industry standards. Ultimately, it will come down to whether a jury finds him competent and trustworthy, and so far, based on what we've seen, his analysis appears thorough, measured, and highly professional. And on that note, I need to be competent too and take a quick break to cover a couple of ads because, as always, the bills don't pay themselves. It's the Christmas season. So before we dive into the expert's conclusion, let me quickly read a couple of sponsor messages. We're sponsored by Veracity, an all-natural approach to slim down, boost energy, and sharpen focus. Their Metabolism Ignite product supports the body's metabolism, reduces hunger by up to 85%, and is clinically proven to help people lose, on average, 9 pounds in 9 days. I've tried it myself, just 2 capsules with breakfast, and I feel energized and focused all day. Veracity combines lemon, verbena, and hibiscus extracts, green coffee bean extract, and magnesium for a natural alternative to GLP-1 South. Head to veracity.com and use code RUSHHOUR for up to 45% off. The second sponsor is Rua, which has made mental health care easier and more affordable. They work with most major insurance plans, with average copays around $15 per session, and offer a network of 15,000 licensed therapists nationwide. Rua helps you find the right professional for your needs and makes care accessible when you need it. Head to rua.com, Russia. Sign up and make sure to tell them our show sent you. Alright, now back to the expert conclusion. Based on his professional background and extensive experience in crisis communications, he is prepared to testify that hiring a crisis communications consultant in the face of potential reputational threats should never be interpreted as evidence of wrongdoing or malicious intent. Such retention is widely recognized as appropriate, prudent, and standard practice for organizations, brands, or high-profile individuals seeking to mitigate reputational risk. Misunderstandings about the role of crisis communications often lead to negative perceptions, but in reality, media monitoring and scenario planning are essential. Standard practices, not attempts to manipulate public sentiment. The scope of work documents prepared by TAG and the scenario planning document It Ends With Us align perfectly with accepted crisis communications procedures. Furthermore, the rapid spike in negative media and social media coverage regarding Blake Lively starting in August 2024 is highly unlikely to have been caused by the work of these consultants. Given the extremely short time frame, tools for measuring sentiment are inherently limited during litigation or sensitive disputes, and any attempt to draw causal conclusions requires a careful, detailed review of the data. And here's the common sense part. Why would Justin Baldoni want to sabotage his own project? It Ends With Us is a film he poured years into, financed with the support of billionaire backer Steve Soitz. Why would he target Blake Lively, the star of the movie, who brings influence, visibility, and even connections to Taylor Swift's massive audience? Smearing her during promotion would be the worst possible business decision, undermining the very people he depends on to make the film a success. Throughout production and promotion, Baldoni repeatedly accommodated Lively's requests, from wardrobe fittings at her penthouse to reworking production logistics. arranging private travel, and even negotiating on-set protocols, all without sacrificing the creative vision of the film. They went above and beyond to facilitate her participation. And yet, despite all this effort, Baldoni was removed from the movie poster and no longer credited as director, while Blake Lively accused him of orchestrating a smear campaign. From what we've seen, the reality is far simpler. Negative public perception of Lively escalated organically. Online audiences reacted to her behavior, her promotion style, and other public appearances. She was off-putting in interviews, came across as dismissive at times, and was promoting brands in ways that didn't resonate with viewers. The internet amplified all of this, but it was not a coordinated smear campaign. The expert's analysis supports that conclusion. What happened was a natural reaction to public behavior, not a manufactured attack. So that's where we stand. Let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this extra weekend content, please hit the like button, subscribe, and leave a comment or compliment. It helps the algorithm and makes it easier for me to keep producing content. Consider this our Super Bowl of celebrity legal drama, and since my Patriots don't play until tonight, I figured I'd give you some bonus coverage. I'll be back tomorrow morning, and remember, I'm here twice a day, every day, for your rush hour commute. See you then. For your rush hour commute. See you then.